In the cobbled streets of a small village, where the stone houses seemed to whisper ancient stories, a boy named Luis made his way. At just 10 years old, he carried a burden far too heavy for his age. Since the tragic accident that had paralyzed his mother, their lives had turned upside down, and Luis, once curious and playful, had to trade his childhood for a life marked by responsibility. Every morning, long before dawn, Luis would wake up, his heart heavy but determined. The first light of day barely illuminated the rooftops as he set out, walking through the narrow alleyways and cobblestone squares of the village. His small backpack, worn with age, tapped against his back as he searched for discarded bottles and cans. These seemingly insignificant objects were little treasures to him, a few extra cents to take to the recycling center, enough to buy the medicine his mother needed, or, on lucky days, a piece of fresh bread to brighten their breakfast. Luis's hands, already rough and weathered, searched through the trash and slipped into corners where passers-by would never think to look. Each time he pulled a new object from the bottom of a bin, he felt a spark of pride. It was a quiet effort, but he knew that each bottle collected, each can exchanged, was a small victory for his mother. She, once full of life and warmth, now lay in bed, her tired gaze following her son as he came and went, growing too fast, maturing too soon. Luis still remembered the sunny days when they played together in the wildflower fields, laughing aloud under the blue sky. Those memories warmed his heart, reminding him of the joyful moments he hoped to relive one day. Yet, despite the hardship of his daily task, he refused to be defeated. His solitude had become his strength. He felt no shame or anger, but rather a quiet pride, the pride of taking care of the one who had always cared for him. In the rare moments when he allowed himself to dream, Luis imagined a better future. A future where he no longer had to scavenge the streets, where his mother would regain her health and vitality, where they could finally laugh together without the weight of survival hanging over them. He dreamed of a small garden filled with colorful flowers, a shelter where his mother could rest in the sun, surrounded by her favorite flowers. In his mind, he saw the days when he could take her to the market, where the smells of fresh bread and juicy fruits filled the air, and where she could choose vegetables and spices, a smile lighting up her tired face. However, one of those mornings, while Luis was crouched in a corner of the street, struggling to pick up a handful of stray cans, a group of older boys approached. They had an air of mystery and danger, their silhouettes rising in the soft light of dawn. One of them, with eyes gleaming with a mischievous spark, whispered enticing promises. If you earn more, you can have more money than you can imagine. Luis felt his heart race, a mix of fear and excitement gripping him. He knew what they were proposing was risky, but the pressing need for his mother, to provide her with medicine and a little comfort, shouted louder than the danger surrounding him. Every minute spent searching the streets reminded him of the anxiety of watching his mother suffer. The expensive pills and medical care he struggled to get for her were the weight he carried on his small shoulders. "It's a robbery, not just any robbery," another boy added, a sly grin on his face. "We're going to rob old Don Ramon's house. We know he keeps money under his mattress." Luis remembered the stories he had heard about Don Ramon, an old, miserly man who always stayed holed up in his house. The rumors said he hoarded wealth in the secrecy of his lair and that his distrust of others made him vulnerable. The idea of an invasion unsettled him, but the image of his mother, bedridden and fragile, appeared in his mind. He could almost hear her labored breathing, each cough a reminder of their desperate situation. The promises of easy money clouded his judgment, and a part of him, the part that wanted to be a carefree child, twisted in despair. "Come on, come with us," urged the leader of the group, his voice full of confidence. Luis, though torn between excitement and fear, took a deep breath. He knew this was a decision that would change his life forever. His thoughts swirled. What would happen if they got caught? Yet, what would happen if he didn't do it, if he returned home empty-handed, with a heart full of regrets? In the end, his desire to help his mother won out over his doubts. He stood up, his legs trembling slightly under the weight of his decision, and followed the boys. Their laughter echoed around him, breaking the morning silence as they headed into the narrow alleys, Luis feeling both excited and terrified. Luis began to imagine his mother's face when, finally, he could bring her not only medicine but also a little comfort, a soft blanket, a plate of hot food. But as they neared their goal, a dull anxiety began to settle in him. What if everything went wrong? As they walked through the narrow, winding streets, Luis felt the weight of their actions bearing down on his heart, a contradiction of emotions that enveloped him like the morning fog. Every step he took seemed to echo in his mind, a constant reminder of the line he was crossing. The echoes of his childhood, his laughter and games, now seemed to belong to another world, while the harsh reality of their imminent act darkened his thoughts. Soon, they arrived in front of Don Ramon's old house, its time-worn facade telling stories of a better past. The walls, cracked and covered in ivy, seemed to whisper warnings, but Luis chose to ignore the voices of the past urging him to turn back. He observed the dusty windows, which over the years had witnessed so many seasons and lives. A gentle breeze lifted dead leaves, adding a touch of melancholy to the already tense atmosphere. The boys exchanged knowing glances, their faces lit up with frenzied excitement. The leader nodded, and everyone knew the moment had come to act. Luis, his hands slightly trembling and his conscience crying out in protest, followed the others toward the back door. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the very ground beneath him wanted to dissuade him. The rusty, tired lock offered little resistance, giving way to their efforts as if it knew the intentions of these young boys were far from pure. They entered silently, their feet moving with an almost ghostly lightness. Once inside, Luis felt a wave of cold wash over him, as if the house itself had been frozen in time. The smell of dust and mildew filled the air, and he swallowed hard. The walls were covered with portraits from another era, stern faces seeming to watch them, witnesses to a secret too heavy to bear. The group moved down the dark corridor, their whispers muffled by the oppressive silence that filled the house. Luis wondered what had led him to join this band of boys, to abandon his morals for the promise of money. An unpleasant warmth settled in his stomach as they advanced, making him feel smaller and more insignificant than ever. What did he really have to gain, besides trouble and perhaps the disappointed look in his mother's eyes if she found out what he had done? At the entrance to Don Ramon's room, Luis froze, as if caught in a strange trance. The weight of the discovery overwhelmed his mind, each second intensifying the strange mix of emotions that engulfed him. The shadow in the room seemed to close in around him, darkening his thoughts, slowly drowning the adrenaline of the robbery. He had never expected to find such a grim scene. Chained to his own bed, Don Ramon was a living symbol of misery and abandonment, far from the image of the selfish miser that the village had painted of him. The rusted chains seemed to mark each second of an eternity of suffering, a silent torment endured alone in the shadows. Luis almost felt the weight of the chain on his own wrist, a cold shiver running down his spine. How could a human being end up like this, deprived of all dignity, locked in his own house like a prisoner with no crime? The injustice and cruelty of the situation shook his deepest convictions. The other boys, still at the entrance, watched Luis with growing nervousness. They were just teenagers caught up in what they thought was a simple game of thieves. But the intensity of the scene was beyond them all. One of them tried again to bring Luis back to reality. "Luis, we didn't come for this. We need to leave, now." Luis slowly turned around, his gaze dark, refusing to take his eyes off Don Ramon. He felt torn between his friendship with the boys and this emerging sense of duty toward the old man. They could steal objects, money, but Don Ramon's life was a far heavier burden, a secret they could not turn their backs on. Taking a deep breath, Luis murmured, determined, "We can't leave. Not like this. He needs help." The group leader clenched his fists, visibly torn between fear and loyalty to Luis. "If we get caught, you know what that means. We'll all end up in jail. Our parents. It's too dangerous." The other boys disappeared into the shadows, leaving Luis alone in the silent house, an odd calm enveloping him. Luis felt the weight of his promise in every fiber of his being, as if, in an instant, he had aged several years. The other boys had fled, their footsteps faint in the night, but he stayed, silently immersed in a decision far beyond him. The calm around him seemed strangely solemn, as though even the house, with its time-worn walls, recognized the significance of the moment. He examined the chains, trying to figure out how to undo them, but the lock was old and complex, far too sturdy for a mere boy to open without help. Don Ramon's eyes followed him, filled with silent gratitude and a stubborn fear, that of a man who had been betrayed too many times to still hope for freedom. Luis bent toward him, whispering with calm determination, "I can't free you now, but I'll find a way. You're not alone anymore." At these words, Don Ramon closed his eyes, as if comforted by a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, a tear ran down his cheek, tracing a fragile path along his wrinkled skin. Before leaving, Luis made sure the old man had water within reach and placed a small piece of bread on the edge of the bed. This simple, almost childlike gesture seemed to bring a bit of life back to the dreary room. Then, without a sound, he left, casting one last glance at Don Ramon, silently promising to return. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a reminder of reality, but Luis felt changed. The fear that had first guided him had been replaced by a fierce conviction. He knew that this night was only the beginning of something much bigger. To free Don Ramon, he would have to face dangers he had never imagined, confront adults far more powerful than him, but he was ready. On the way back, Luis felt his heart pounding in his chest. The image of Don Ramon chained haunted him, as did the desperate need to get him out of this unjust situation. Each step along the dusty path was a struggle against his own doubts. Who could he alert about the secret without risking being seen as a child with too vivid an imagination? He knew very few people would believe his story, and that isolated him. Yet, going back without a plan or support seemed unthinkable. He slept little that night, his mind swirling like an endless storm. At the first light of day, Luis prepared a modest breakfast for his mother and, his mind weighed down by what he had seen, resolved to speak to someone he trusted. He thought of Carmen, the village wise woman, an older woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, respected for her wisdom and ancient knowledge. Silently, he crossed the narrow streets to Carmen's small house, hoping that her advice would help him find a solution. Upon arrival, he was greeted by the sweet scent of dried herbs and incense that lingered in the air. Carmen looked at him with her piercing eyes and motioned for him to sit. In a low, almost trembling voice, Luis told her everything. He described the chains, the shadow of Don Ramon in the abandoned barn, his desperate look. Carmen, who had once known Don Ramon as a strong and respected man, listened silently, her face gradually hardening. She seemed to weigh each word, each detail, her gaze darkening. When Luis finished, a long silence fell. Carmen slowly straightened, her face grave. "If what you're saying is true, this man is in great danger, and you too, my boy. If you decide to get involved," she murmured, her words heavy as a warning. "But sometimes, life requires courage from those it chooses. You'll need to act with intelligence and caution, for this path will not be without obstacles." She placed a reassuring hand on Luis's shoulder and, after a moment of reflection, whispered some advice in his ear, explaining how to avoid drawing too much attention. Then, with a measured gesture, she rose, disappeared behind the counter of her small shop, and returned with a rusted key, handing it to Luis. "This is the key to Don Ramon's old shed," she murmured like a secret, her eyes gleaming with a strange light. "He keeps some tools there, and perhaps you'll find something that could help him. But never forget, my boy, caution is your ally." She added a handful of provisions to a small bag, corn cakes and some herbs she advised Luis to use to stay awake during the nights that might come. As Luis left Carmen's house, his heart was heavy with apprehension but also filled with a new determination. As night fell, when the village was wrapped in a thick silence and only the shadows of the street lamps flickered in the deserted alleys, Luis ventured, fear and hope intertwined, toward Don Ramon's old house. The cold night air enveloped the landscape, but Luis felt the warmth of the key Carmen had given him like a talisman of courage. His tense fingers gripped it tightly, while each beat of his heart seemed to echo, like a drum in the oppressive quiet of the night. The cobbled streets seemed to stretch out as he moved forward, each step amplifying the echo of his shoes on the stone, reminding him that every movement drew attention. He paused for a moment to make sure no one had followed him before approaching the shed of Don Ramon. Reaching the massive wooden door, he carefully inserted the key into the rusty lock, praying it wouldn't make any noise that might wake the villagers. A click sounded, clear and sharp, breaking the night's silence. Luis held his breath, but no sound came to disturb the surrounding peace. Slowly pushing the door open, it creaked, revealing the dark, dusty interior of the shed. The air was heavy, laden with the acrid scent of old wood and rusted metal. Tools with worn handles, old wooden crates, and various long-forgotten objects littered the floor, remnants of another time. Luis searched quickly, illuminating the dark corners with his trembling oil lamp. After a few moments of searching, he found a crowbar covered in dust. His grip on the object tightened, and he felt a spark of determination within him, an unexpected courage for a boy his age. He slowly exited the shed, closed the door behind him, and sneaked around to the back of the house where he had seen the boys enter earlier in the day. A strange tension hung in the air as he approached the room where Don Ramon was held captive. The night seemed to hold its breath, as though it itself sensed the significance of this moment. Luis gently pressed against the door, which opened with a soft creak. In the darkness of the room, Don Ramon's face appeared, his dull eyes lighting up at the sight of Luis. His eyes widened in a mix of surprise and hope, as if he couldn't believe this appearance. Luis placed a finger to his lips, signaling for him to remain silent, and approached carefully. "I've come back, as promised," he whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with determination. His trembling hands slipped the crowbar under the chains, trying to pry them loose without making a sound. The metal links resisted for a moment, but Luis, focused, didn't give up. After what felt like an eternity, the chains gave way with a dull clatter, falling heavily to the ground. Don Ramon let out a long sigh, a mix of relief, gratitude, and restrained emotion. His sore wrists gradually regained their freedom, but more than the physical relief, it was the glimmer of hope in his eyes that revealed his gratitude. Tears shimmered in the old man's eyes, illuminated by the faint light of the oil lamp. He placed a trembling hand on Luis's shoulder, and in a breathless voice, murmured with deep gratitude, "Thank you, my boy. I will never forget what you've done for me." Luis felt a surge of anger rise within him as he listened to Don Ramon's story, but he knew he had to contain himself to avoid betraying their presence in the silence of the night. "Why did they do this to you?" he whispered, his voice vibrating with controlled fury. Don Ramon lowered his head, his gaze lost in a painful past, and then sighed, his voice broken by deep sadness. "They are people from my own family, Luis, nephews. Close ones I had trusted completely," he replied, his words broken by pain. "To them, I was no longer an uncle or an elder to respect. No, I had become an obstacle between them and the money I had saved up over the years. It was never a large fortune, but enough to live my old age without depending on anyone." Don Ramon continued, his eyes clouded with emotion, his voice low but trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing, Luis. I entrusted them with my savings, let them manage some of my property. I wanted to give them a chance to make it, to show they could be worthy of that responsibility. But they saw me as a means, as someone to manipulate to get what they wanted. As soon as they had the opportunity, they betrayed me without hesitation." Luis felt his heart tighten at this ruthless betrayal. His fists clenched, a spark of determination shining in his eyes. The injustice he perceived seemed to consume him. He wanted to scream, to promise vengeance for this man who had done nothing wrong, who had only loved and believed in people he thought were his family. But before he could speak, Don Ramon gently placed his hand on his shoulder, and the boy felt the quiet strength of the old man, battered yet dignified. "Thank you, Luis, for listening to me, for having the courage to come back for me, Don Ramon said, a faint smile lighting up his tired face. Through your actions, you've given me something precious, freedom. Maybe I'll never get back what they took from me. Maybe I'll never see that little comfort I had built again, but I am free because of you. A burning determination flared in Luis's eyes. We won't let it end like this, Don Ramon, he promised, his voice resolute. You deserve to get back not only your freedom but your dignity. Together, we'll find a way to expose those who did this to you. I can't just sit idly by. Don Ramon smiled, touched by the sincerity of the young boy. After a long moment of silence, an idea crossed his mind, and his gaze filled with a glimmer of hope. Luis, what you just said proves how special you are. I know this may sound surprising, but I'd like you to become my heir. Not just for my material possessions, but for my values, for what I've learned throughout my life. What I have, I want to pass on to you. Luis stepped back slightly, his eyes wide with surprise and disbelief. Me? But I'm just a child, an ordinary boy. I don't deserve such a responsibility. Don Ramon interrupted him with a firm but kind voice. No, Luis, you're wrong. What you did for me tonight shows rare courage and kindness. It is precisely your bravery, your sense of justice, and your compassion that make you the true heir to what I have to offer. I want to pass on to you more than just objects or wealth. What I will entrust to you are the means to change things around you, to build a better future for others. Luis felt a wave of emotion flood through him, and he slowly nodded, his heart filled with deep gratitude. He now understood that this inheritance was not just a reward, but a noble burden that he was willing to accept. I will do everything in my power to honor this trust, Don Ramon. I promise to never betray this hope you have placed in me. A few weeks later, Luis and Don Ramon's lives had taken an unexpected turn. Thanks to their alliance, Luis had not only helped restore Don Ramon's dignity, but they had also begun to weave a deep bond of trust and friendship. One day, as the sun slowly rose over the village, painting the sky in golden hues, Don Ramon invited Luis to his home. Luis felt his heart race as he thought back to their last exchange. The old man had mentioned that he had something special to show him, and the excitement, mixed with anxiety, filled the air. Upon arriving at the house, Don Ramon led Luis to a room at the back, where the walls were covered with old books and mementos of a bygone time. At the center of the room stood a large wooden chest, worn by time, but still sturdy. Here is what I have to show you, Luis, said Don Ramon, a nostalgic smile on his face. This chest contains everything I've gathered over the years. I want to give you 90% of my hidden fortune. Luis, stunned, widened his eyes. But why? I don't deserve so much. You are the one who chose to see the human in me, the one who had the courage to help me when others would not. This fortune should not remain just a material inheritance. It must be used to create change, to help those who, like us, need a voice. I want you to become the heir of this vision, Don Ramon explained with deep determination. Luis took a deep breath, his heart pounding. I will do everything to honor this trust. I want to use this money to help my mother and others in need. Don Ramon nodded, moved. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. With these resources, you can bring light into the darkness of this village. You can create opportunities for the young, help struggling families, and ensure that no one is ever chained as I was. With trembling hands, Luis opened the chest. Inside, he found bundles of carefully stacked bills, valuable objects, and sparkling jewels glowing in the soft morning light. But more than all of that, he felt the weight of the responsibilities that came with it. This wasn't just money, but a chance to restore hope. I'll make sure it counts, Luis murmured, tears in his eyes. Their exchanged look sealed a pact of solidarity and determination. Together, they would transform what had been an inheritance of pain into a legend of rebirth. Now, bearing a heavy but precious inheritance, Luis vowed to fight for justice and build a better future for all those who believed in him.